It is October 1942, and somewhere in the hills outside Liuchow, in southern China, a young German mechanic is crouched over the wreckage of a Japanese fighter plane by torchlight. The aircraft is a Mitsubishi Zero, the most feared machine in the Pacific skies, and it has come down largely intact after clipping treetops during a raid. Around him, a dozen Chinese laborers heave at bent metal while overhead, engines drone through the darkness, searching. The man's name is Gerhard Neumann. 3 years earlier, he had been a stateless refugee with a revoked German passport, interned by the British as a suspected enemy agent. Now he is the one man General Claire Chennault trusts to rebuild an enemy warplane from splinters, using tools scavenged from a war zone that has almost none to spare. Within hours of the crash, Japanese bombers return to hunt for the wreck, forcing Neumann and his crew to drag the fuselage into the undergrowth and wait out the raids in silence. It will take him the best part of 2 months, working through malaria, typhus, and jaundice so severe that for a time he can only direct his mechanics from a camp bed, wrapped in a fur-lined flying suit, too weak to stand. What he is building is not simply an aircraft, it is intelligence. Every rivet and control surface he coaxes back into shape will tell Allied pilots, for the first time, exactly what they are up against. This is the story of a German-born mechanic who spent the Second World War keeping American war machines running against the country of his birth, at a moment when his own government would have called him a traitor twice over, first for fleeing, and then for what he built once he was gone. It is a story with no straightforward villain, fought not with rifles but with wrenches, and it says something uncomfortable and important about who actually wins wars. Not always the side with more men, but very often the side with better mechanics. By the time Neumann reached China in 1938, the war he would spend 6 years fighting had not yet begun, but the machinery of it was already grinding into motion. He was 20 years old, trained as an engineer at one of Germany's most respected technical colleges, and unwilling to serve in an army that, as a young man from a Jewish family, offered him nothing but danger. A notice on a college bulletin board announcing that the Chinese government wanted German mechanical engineers, with military service conveniently deferred, gave him an exit that felt, in his own later telling, more like an adventure than an escape. It would prove to be both. The problem the war would hand him was not one Germany had trained him to solve. It was logistical, and it was brutal in its simplicity. Modern warfare in the 1940s did not run on courage or doctrine so much as it ran on serviceable machines, and serviceable machines broke constantly. Aircraft engines seized in the tropical heat of Yunnan province. Spare parts that should have arrived by ship or rail instead had to be flown over the Himalayas along the notoriously lethal supply route pilots called the hump, and what did arrive was never enough. The American volunteer group, the assortment of pilots that would become famous as the Flying Tigers, had barely more than 100 worn Curtiss P-40 fighters to defend all of free China's skies, and every one of those aircraft depended on ground crews improvising with whatever scraps a war-torn interior could offer. There was no factory nearby to machine a replacement part. There was no depot stacked with spares. When a radiator cracked, there was no supplier to call. The nearest thing to a solution was whatever a mechanic could invent on the spot, and invention under those conditions was not a luxury, it was survival. Air crews who could not fly could not fight, and the Japanese Imperial Army knew it, targeting maintenance facilities as readily as airfields. The Allies were fighting a two-front battle in China, one against Japanese pilots in the air, and a quieter one against entropy on the ground, where broken machines threatened to ground an entire air force before the enemy ever fired a shot. Consider what the supply chain actually looked like from the ground crew's perspective. A spare engine block, if one existed anywhere in theater, might sit in a depot in India, separated from the airstrip that needed it by a mountain range so dangerous that transport crews simply called it the hump, and lost aircraft attempting the crossing on a fairly routine basis. Requisition paperwork that in Europe might take days to process could take weeks in China, assuming it was processed at all. Humidity rotted rubber seals within months, Dust from unpaved airstrips scoured engine cylinders raw. None of this was written into any American maintenance manual, because no American maintenance manual had been written with a theater this remote, this undersupplied, or this improvised in mind. The scale of the shortfall is worth putting in concrete terms. At the height of its operations, the American Volunteer Group fielded fewer than 100 serviceable P-40 fighters to defend an area of China roughly the size of Western Europe, and attrition, both from combat and from ordinary mechanical failure, chipped away at that number relentlessly. Every aircraft grounded for want of a part was, in practical terms, an aircraft the Japanese Air Force did not have to shoot down. The maths were unforgiving, and they were the maths Neumann inherited the moment he put on a uniform. It was into this second, unglamorous battle that Neumann was thrown, first as a stranded refugee doing odd mechanical jobs to survive, then as an official of the Chinese Air Force Purchasing Commission, and finally, after Pearl Harbor, as a member of Chennault's headquarters squadron, where he was nicknamed Herman the German for his thick accent and his ferocious work ethic. The problem he inherited was not how to build something extraordinary from scratch. It was how to keep a fragile, overstretched, wildly improvised air campaign in the air at all, with almost nothing to work with. Neumann's genius, if it can be called that, was not in any single invention, but in a philosophy of repair born from scarcity. He had trained as an auto mechanic under a strict Prussian master before ever entering engineering college, and that apprenticeship had taught him something the war would make essential: that a machine could very often be persuaded to work again with materials never intended for the job, provided the person doing the persuading understood exactly how the thing was meant to function in the first place. Working out of dispersed airstrips with barely a proper hangar between them, Neumann became known for teaching ground crews to solve problems Curtiss engineers back in Buffalo, New York, had never anticipated. When radiator seals failed and no replacement gaskets existed within 1,000 miles, his crews learned to pack the joints with cow manure, which hardened into a surprisingly effective seal under engine heat. When Bakelite electrical components cracked in the humidity and no synthetic replacement could be flown in over the hump, carved buffalo horn filled the gap almost as well. None of this was written in any manual. It was engineering by necessity, passed hand to hand between mechanics who had learned the hard way that a P-40 sitting idle for want of a 5-cent part was as good as a P-40 shot down. The scale of the task only grew. When the American Volunteer Group was formally absorbed into the United States Army Air Forces in the summer of 1942, Neumann was inducted as a staff sergeant, despite still holding German citizenship in a country now formally at war with Germany, and assigned as chief engineer to the 76th Fighter Squadron. His job was no longer simply to keep aircraft flying, but to extract usable intelligence from broken machinery, which is precisely what Chennault asked of him that October, when he was ordered to make the downed Zero airworthy again. Working first in the open, then later in a proper hangar with electricity and power tools once the wreck was moved to Kuilin, Neumann and his Chinese mechanics stripped, repaired, and reassembled a fighter aircraft none of them had ever been trained on, using instruction manuals none of them could read, in a language none of them spoke. Damaged control surfaces were rebuilt from scratch. Instruments were cross-referenced against captured Japanese technical drawings. The work dragged on for weeks, then months, and very nearly killed the man doing it. When Neumann collapsed with malaria and typhus simultaneously, work did not stop so much as slow to a crawl, with him directing repairs from a camp cot, too weak to walk the length of the hangar. By early 1943, the aircraft flew. It was, by any reasonable standard, a small miracle of field engineering, a machine built for one air force, wrecked in combat, and coaxed back to life by mechanics from 3 different nations working from guesswork and captured paperwork in a jungle clearing. There is no surviving production tally for how many individual repairs, large and small, Neumann and his crews carried out over those years, and it would be dishonest to invent a precise figure where the historical record offers none. What the record does make clear is the sheer breadth of what fell under his responsibility. Propeller assemblies, engine mounts, hydraulic lines, radio sets, and eventually an entire foreign aircraft rebuilt essentially from first principles. Some of that work is documented in detail in Neumann's own later writing and in squadron records. A great deal more of it is not lost to the ordinary churn of a maintenance log in a war zone, where a mechanic's daily triumphs rarely made it into any official history at all. The operational payoff was immediate and significant. American test pilots flew the reconstructed Zero directly against United States fighters over Kunming, and what they learned reshaped Allied tactics in the Pacific theater. The Zero's astonishing lightness, which gave it a turning circle no American fighter could match, was confirmed in the air rather than guessed at from combat reports, validating the doctrine Chennault had already been drilling into his pilots. Never turn with a Zero, dive and strike, then disengage before it can bring its maneuverability to bear. That tactic, tested against a machine Neumann had rebuilt with his own hands, would go on to save American pilots' lives across the Pacific for the remainder of the war. The aircraft itself was later shipped to the United States, where it toured as both a technical exhibit and a prop for war bond drives, evidence to the American public of what Allied engineering, however improvised, could achieve. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and there is a great deal more to this story still to come. It is worth placing Neumann's improvised methods against what the other side was doing with similar problems, because the contrast is instructive. Japanese ground crews, operating under an even more centralized and rigid maintenance doctrine, had far less latitude to improvise and far less access to captured Allied equipment to study in the way the Allies were now studying theirs. German maintenance units on the Eastern Front, meanwhile, ran an almost opposite system: heavily centralized tank and vehicle repair depots in the rear, designed on paper to be efficient, but which by 1942 were being overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the fighting, with spare parts production lagging so badly behind the front's needs that officers later admitted the shortage had become one of the war's quiet, unglamorous catastrophes. Where German doctrine prized centralization and precision and struggled badly when supply lines broke down, the scrappy, decentralized, improvise-anything culture that men like Neumann built in China had no formal doctrine behind it at all. Only the instinct that a machine kept flying today was worth more than a machine repaired perfectly next month. It was not that Allied engineering was inherently superior. It was that, in the China theater specifically, a culture of relentless improvisation proved better suited to the chaos of the supply lines than any centralized system, German or otherwise, could have been. The material impact of any single reconstructed aircraft is, inevitably, hard to measure precisely, and it would be dishonest to claim the Zero rebuild alone changed the course of a war fought across an entire ocean. What can be said with more confidence is the psychological and doctrinal effect. Confirming, rather than merely suspecting, the Zero's true performance envelope gave American pilots something invaluable: certainty. Fighting an enemy aircraft, whose exact capabilities remain a mystery, breeds hesitation, and hesitation kills. Once Chennault's pilots knew precisely what a Zero could and could not do, that uncertainty evaporated, and tactics that had previously been an educated guess became doctrine, taught with confidence to every new pilot who arrived in theater. There is also an honest limit to what can be claimed here, and it is worth stating plainly. Much of what is known about the fine detail of Neumann's repair work in China comes from his own later recollections, recorded decades after the fact in his autobiography and in interviews, rather than from contemporaneous squadron paperwork that might independently verify every episode. Wartime maintenance logs from a chaotic, under-resourced theater were never kept with an eye to posterity, and many simply did not survive. The broad outline, his role in the Flying Tigers, his rank, his work on the captured Zero, and his subsequent citation for wartime service is corroborated across multiple independent sources. The smaller, more colorful details of daily improvisation are, inevitably, harder to verify with the same certainty. Neumann's broader legacy, though, extends well beyond one aircraft. The culture of field improvisation he helped build in China would echo through the rest of his career in ways nobody in that jungle hangar could have predicted. After the war, having crossed Asia and the Middle East overland by jeep with his wife in an extraordinary journey to reach the United States, Neumann was naturalized as an American citizen by a special act of Congress, an honor reflecting just how significant his wartime service was judged to have been. He joined General Electric's fledgling jet engine division in 1948, and the same instinct for elegant mechanical problem-solving that had once repaired a Zero with buffalo horn and cow manure would go on to produce genuine breakthroughs in jet propulsion, including the variable stator compressor design that materially improved engine efficiency and became standard across the industry. He would eventually lead GE's entire aircraft engine business through its transformation into one of the dominant forces in commercial and military aviation. None of the reconstructed Zero survives in its wartime form. The aircraft was eventually broken down for study after its American tour, its data absorbed into training programs, and its physical fate now uncertain, as is common for wartime technical exhibits once their propaganda value expired. What does survive is Neumann's own account of the episode, preserved in his 1984 autobiography, and the institutional memory of an air campaign that very nearly ran out of aircraft before it ran out of enemies. So return for a moment to that hangar in Kuilin, to a sick man directing repairs from a camp bed because he refuses to let the work stop while he recovers. That image is, in miniature, the entire story of what won the air war in China. It was not the newest technology. It was not superior numbers. The Allies rarely had those in this theater. It was the refusal to let a broken machine stay broken, sustained by mechanics willing to solve problems no manual had ever anticipated, using whatever the jungle happened to provide. Gerhard Neumann arrived in Asia a stateless refugee with a revoked passport and nothing resembling a plan. He left it a naturalized American citizen, decorated for wartime service, on his way to becoming one of the most consequential engineers in the history of American aviation. In between, he spent years crouched under aircraft that were never his own, in a war that was not initially his fight, fixing machines that belonged to a country that would one day make him one of its own. He taught starving, overstretched ground crews that ingenuity could substitute for supply, that a problem without an official solution still had a solution, and that the difference between a grounded air force and a fighting one often came down to a single stubborn mechanic who refused to give up on a piece of broken metal. The Allies did not win the air war over China because they had better aircraft. For most of the conflict, they very plainly did not. They won it, in no small part, because men like Herman the German kept flying the aircraft they had, long after any reasonable estimate said those aircraft should have been grounded for good. It is not the kind of victory that makes for triumphant newsreel footage. There are no dramatic aerial kills in a maintenance log, no medals struck for a well-packed radiator seal, but every fighter that took off because a mechanic had found a way, when there should not have been one, was a small act of defiance against an enemy that assumed the Allies would simply run out of working machines. They never did. Not because the parts kept arriving, because they mostly did not, but because the people fixing the aircraft refused to stop. Gerhard Neumann rebuilt a Japanese Zero from wreckage with tools that should not have been sufficient, in a language he could not read, while his own body was failing him, and in doing so, he helped an air force he had joined as a foreigner see, for the first time, exactly what it was fighting. That is not a footnote to the war in the Pacific. That is how a great deal of it was actually won.